Some forms of Christian education today isolate young minds from reading broadly. Christian education, in many cases, is a type of instruction that inoculates people against other philosophies, religions, and ways of life. In an inoculation, people are given a small, often distorted dose of another thought system, such as Buddhism or Marxism or whatnot, just enough to attack and to undermine without truly understanding. The whole idea of a Christian college or Bible college is often to keep people away from so-called liberal or secular universities with their massive libraries. And algorithms tend to keep people watching and listening only to what they want to hear. Fortunately, even though people pay good money to isolate themselves, both ideas and books have a way of worming their way into our consciousness. As a result, the mind can be liberated from the self-forged shackles of its own ideology. Clement of Alexandria, in the 6th book of his Stromata, tells us that Valentinus is the chief, literally the chorus leader of those advocating for commonality. He then quotes from Valentinus's homily on friends, quote, "Many of those things written in publicly available books are found written in the Church of God. They hold in common expressions from the heart, a code written in the heart. This is the people of the beloved, the people who is loved and loves him." This fragment tells us that Valentinus had more than one published sermon and that at least some of these sermons were named. This particular sermon was apparently a meditation on friendship. Aristotle had written on friends, and there were other treatises on friendship during this era. Valentinus's friends were apparently members of his own Christian circle. According to the Johannine wave, Jesus called his followers friends. And according to 3 John 15, friends is a designation for fellow Christians. In the context of the Stromata, Clement argues that Greek philosophy contains a part of the truth providentially revealed by God as a preparation for Christian faith. Greek authors were always dependent on sources of wisdom flowing from the true source of all. Clement then quotes Valentinus and Isidore, son of Basilides, in support of this very point. We gather that Valentinus emphasized the theme of commonality. Commonality, or kinates in Greek, could mean many things. For Epiphanes, son of Carpocrates, it meant the common ownership of all things, egalitarianism. But commonality could simply mean communion, fellowship, or sharing. Since this is a homily on friends, and since friends share both property and goods, it seems best to understand commonality as the kind of fellowship or sharing which is common among friends. In the context of the Stromata, Clement argues that the truth of Christ was commonly known long before Jesus. People had enough access to truth, at least, to make people responsible. Christ made sure to publish the truth by telling the gospel even in Hades. Thus, even those who perished in the great flood, says Clement, had the correct knowledge of Christ. Clement takes Valentinus's quote to mean that Christian truth was and is already known in other literature, whether Jewish literature or in Greek philosophical texts. But probably Valentinus did not, in fact, refer to Jewish scriptures in this case, because Jewish scripture consists largely of a law that was, in fact, written on paper or papyrus, namely the Torah. The truth underscored by Valentinus is truth written on the heart in a presumably unwritten code. It would be surprising, moreover, for Valentinus to call Jewish scriptures public and to distinguish them from the writings of the church. In many churches, Jewish scriptures were read and used as scripture. So probably Valentinus meant to refer to any kind of Greek literature, whether poetry or prose, novel, or philosophical tractate that could be found in a library or bookshop. For his part, Clement was making an apologetic point. Everyone knows the truth, which makes them subject to judgment when they reject it. It seems doubtful that this was Valentinus's point. I take Valentinus in this fragment to be commenting on the reading practices of his Christian circle. They were not forced to read solely scriptural texts. They could visit a public library or bookshop and find Christian truth because the truth is universal. The Nicene preacher radicalized this point when he saw the Phrygian god Attis as a manifestation of Christ. This preacher also saw Christ in gods like Osiris, Isis, Hermes, and the Samothracian gods. Christ was the culmination of every mystery cult. Now, this Nicene preacher was probably not a former member of every one of these mystery cults. Instead, he had read widely in the literature on Greco-Roman cults so that he knew the gods of other nations and their worship practices. The preacher is evidence that at least some truths revealed in scriptures can also be found in public libraries, if only one has the eyes to see them. This insight is analogous to the modern historical notion that the writings which became the New Testament are instances of Greco-Roman literature, and that most ideas in the New Testament have parallels in Greco-Roman or Jewish writings. There's very few ideas in the world which are perfectly unique. Things written in the Church of God are evidently Christian scriptures. In Valentinus's day, there was no canon of 27 Christian books called the New Testament. The scriptures for Valentinus were a mixture of oral and written sources, the written sources being the Pauline letters, and at least two Gospels, those now called according to Matthew and according to John. Valentinus did not, it seems, understand the Septuagint as scripture, even though he certainly used it. Valentinus explains the similarity between secular and sacred literature by a common origin. What they share is a common origin in the heart. It's the heart that can be a house of daimones filled with inappropriate desires, but the heart can also be visited by God and be made full of light. This is where the divine writing occurs. There is a law or custom or code. All of these are fair translations of nomos. There is a code written in the heart, an idea attested as far back as Jeremiah 38:33 in the Septuagint. Quote, I will give laws into their thoughts and write them on their hearts. The idea appears again in Romans 2:14, where those who have the law written in their heart are Gentiles who act ethically by nature, not by their knowledge of Scripture. The idea of an unwritten law, or nomos agraphos, was common in this period. The idea that it was written in the heart is an image that derives from what became both Jewish and Christian scripture. So Valentinus is tapping into a common idea. The law written in the heart is not an ethnic code. It's a code of conscience. This code is then oddly identified with the people of the beloved. But how can an unwritten code or custom be identified with a people unless the people themselves are the expression of the inner code? Apparently, we are to conceive of a group of people who have the law written in their hearts. These people were probably members of Valentinus' own church, which consisted probably mostly of Gentiles at this period. But whether ethnically Jewish or Gentile, the people of the beloved don't need an external written code such as the Torah. They have an external text, which is called the gospel, but the gospel lives in their hearts as well. The beloved evidently refers to the beloved Son of God, as was common in Christian literature. When he refers to the people of the beloved, what Valentinus gives us, I think, is a definition of the church. It isn't an elect race rigidly chosen by God, but a people loved by God's beloved and those who love him in turn. The emphasis is overwhelmingly on love, which, in order to be love, must be freely chosen. What makes the Christian community possible is love for Christ. According to John 16:27, The Father loves the believer because the believer loves Christ. There's no sign of an elite race of spirituals here who belong to a higher family by nature. So the very quotation of this fragment contradicts Clement's earlier point that for Valentinus, people are saved by nature. Clement was doubtless correct that Valentinus made truth common to all people, as he says. Truth was and is not something accessible only to Christians. Valentinus here certainly does not fit any sort of profile of a secretive teacher. It's true that so-called Gnostics were typically accused of having and teaching secret doctrines. But here, Valentinus is accused of making truth too public and common. Judging by his own thought in writing, Valentinus himself was an avid and wide reader of texts, and he expected his audience to be the same. But the language of Valentinus shows that he had been impressed most deeply by the language of Christian scripture, for it continually flowers forth from his prose. And judging by Valentinus's disciples, they got the master's message. They read the scriptures, primarily Matthew and John, it seems, as gospels. The Christianity of Valentinus was worldly and cosmopolitan. He was no ostrich with his head in the sand. His church was also the public library, whether it be found in Alexandria or Rome. His form of Christian education was not based on the fear of infiltration and loss of integrity and identity. Valentinus had seen the Logos in a vision, and this enabled him to see the Logos in other places as well. Those who know the truth can see its seeds glinting like gemstones on library shelves. The truth is out there because the truth is a person, and that person, that reality, can be anywhere.